Today we're going to learn about George H.W. Bush, President of the United States. Now, when he was president, everyone just called him George Bush, right? Retroactively, we have to call him George H.W. Bush because his son, George W. Bush, became president as well, right? So, George Herbert Walker Bush. So, he was born in 1924, and his father is a pretty well-known guy. Right? His father is Prescott Bush, who was a Republican senator from Connecticut. The Bush family can trace their stuff all the way back to the Mayflower. And he is a World War II hero. He was 18 when he became a fighter pilot in the Pacific, making him, I believe, the youngest one on the American side, at least at the beginning. So he's a World War II hero, and he is the last president that we have had that has fought in combat in World War II. And he comes home and he marries Barbara, right? His wife, who he will be married to until she dies. A very long love story. So, he's in Texas. He relocates his family to Texas. He's not in his father's shadow in Connecticut. Okay? There's a lot of business ventures in oil. And when I talk about Ronald Reagan, it kind of surprises the class to hear that California used to be a very Republican place, in that he felt his need to pivot to be a Republican to win election day. Texas is kind of the flip of that. Texas was basically a one-party state run by Democrats. And Bush is going to be some of the first times where Republicans are going to make real efforts in the state. So he runs to be senator twice in Texas, in 1964 against Democrat Ralph Yarborough, and he's going to come up short. And then in 1970 against Lloyd Benson as his replacement. And both of these he loses, but as you can see, that 46% for a Republican during the time in Texas was pretty good. And Lloyd Benson, he's going to end up indirectly running against later on in life. But he's been a good soldier for the party. So he's going to get some thing. So he's going to, under Nixon, he'll become ambassador to the United Nations, representing the U.S. there. He will also be ambassador to China, following that up. As you can see, they got a portrait of Mao behind him. And then he will be the head of Central Intelligence in the CIA under President Ford. He's also the head of the Republican National Committee some point during this. And so in 1980, he ran for president. And he called Reagan's, trickle-down economics voodoo economics. He was pretty contentious of it, but they ended up becoming his running mate, and then he's vice president for 8 years. So Reagan, because of the 22nd Amendment, can't run for a third term, which means his vice president is the most likely person. And so in 1988, George W. Bush runs to be president of the United States. And he is pretty much considered the front runner. And he doesn't campaign, and that kind of bites him in the butt a little bit. But like the Iowa caucuses, you have Kansas Senator Bob Dole, and you have televangelist Pat Robertson, both try and run in Iowa, and and Dole wins, and Bush gets in third, right? Which means that he has to kick it into high gear, and he does end up pretty easily winning the nomination. And he's looking for a running mate, and he ends up picking Dan Quayle, this young senator from Indiana. Right? And this is a ticket balance, right? Bush has tons of experience. He's kind of now on the older side. Dan Quayle is young, less experienced. He's from the Midwest, as opposed to Bush, who made his name in Texas. And but Dan Quayle has a tendency to say things that get him into trouble. And there's an incident in which he's at a school and a kid correctly spells potato, ending with an O, and then he reprimands the kid and says he has to put an E on it, and just it led to the public perception of it. Now, on the Democratic side, his opponent is going to end up being Michael Dukakis. There's a liberal governor of Massachusetts. And then Dukakis is going to pick Lloyd Benson, a man that had beaten Bush in Texas in the past, as his running mate. So they go there, and you get to the point where Bush wins. And Bush wins pretty handily. He's going to be, this is the last time anyone's gotten over 400 electoral college votes, possibly the last time this has occurred. And he generally does worse than Reagan in his landslide, but it still doesn't mean that it's not a landslide. So now he is president of the United States. And when it comes to domestic policy, by far the most enduring legacy of George H.W. Bush is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So Bush is in a situation we've had no president since. He never had his own party control Congress. Okay, so since him, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden all had their parties control Congress when they entered office. So they had some chance. Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate. So for anything to get through, Bush had to compromise and work with them. And it produced this wonderful piece of legislation with the work of Iowa Senator Tom Harkin, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which ends legal discrimination of people with disabilities, which was simply legal. It wasn't protected by the Civil Rights Act before this. And so, without going into a bunch of details about the American Disabilities Act, it requires your job to provide you with reasonable accommodations for your disability, as well as for businesses to provide reasonable accommodations, as long as those do not persist an undue hardship. So just a pretty easy example here. If someone was handicapped, right, a reasonable accommodation, if they're in a wheelchair, right, is that they can have their office on the first floor instead of the fifth floor, right? Right, that's not undue hardship. This is also we get the rules with service animals, right? Where service animals are legal and you're allowed to ask if it is a service animal, but you can't force them to prove it. Right, the service can cover like emotional support animals and stuff, but that's why businesses have to allow service animals, and how new buildings have to be made to be handicap accessible. And this is something that I really noticed when I had a young girl on a stroller with my daughter. We could tell if something was built before or after the ADA because can I get around it in a stroller? Stairs and stuff, right? So this is an enduring legacy. He had several important things that happened overseas. The Cold War ends. The Soviet Union collapses during the presidency of George W. Bush. Right? The dictator of Panama, Manuel Noriega, Right? We're going to do an incursion called Operation Just Cause that will force Noriega out of power in Panama, so he can be put on trial for drug charges. And like we play loud music to try to force him out of an embassy. Right? That's pretty short-lived. There's in the Middle East the Persian Gulf War, in which Iraq, controlled by a dictator, Saddam Hussein, invades neighboring country of Kuwait. And George H.W. Bush is going to lead a coalition to the UN that is going to intervene. And the rule is that Iraq, you got to leave Kuwait. Okay? Or we're going to come in and we're going to kick you out. The mandate is not to remove Saddam Hussein, no matter how terrible he is. Right, so this is Bush in Saudi Arabia. They're waiting there. And so it's a situation where it's Operation Desert Storm, where as part of coalition forces, we go in and we push the Iraqis out of Kuwait. This does not remove Saddam from power. Right, is there. So Bush had some pretty sky-high approval ratings after some of these events. But he's going to actually end up losing re-election. So the 1992 presidential election is a three-way race, right? We have Bush running for re-election, we have Bill Clinton, the Democrat, and then we have Ross Perot, the Texas billionaire, running third party. And so once you get to like the situation where we have their debates, right? Bush is getting hit by both Clinton and Perot for this. And part of the thing is that Bush had given a speech where he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And as part of a compromise with Congress, he had a bill that raised taxes. So this was a weird situation in which Perot re-enters and the vote is split. Right? Like early on, it looked like Perot might actually win, but he left and he came back. But Bush ultimately loses. Again, the vote is split three ways. Where Perot doesn't win any states, but he is perceived to have hurt Bush more than Clinton. So Bill Clinton, with only 43% of the vote, is able to win a bunch of states. And so George H.W. Bush loses re-election. And so you have these situations where people are voting for three different candidates. So Bush loses, but he doesn't leave public life. He lives quite a life after this. Okay, so in 1994, he supports his son, George W. Bush, who unseats the Democratic governor of Texas. Okay, and so when George H.W. Bush is first running statewide in Texas, it's seen as this very long shot for Republicans. Here, 1994, this is the last time any Democrat won statewide in Texas. 1995, he's with First Lady Hillary Clinton, seeing his official portrait unveiled. In 1998, both of his sons are successfully elected governors of states. Okay, George W. Bush heavily reelected in Texas, George and Jeb Bush winning in Florida. So he's got two sons that are both governors. And then his son becomes president, so he advises his son on these various things. And a lot of his cabinet officials are going to play a role in the second Bush administration. And then he spends a lot of his time attending funerals. Okay? He's at Nixon's funeral in 1994. He was a keynote speaker at Reagan's funeral in 2004. He was a keynote speaker at Ford's funeral in 2006. 2007, he was invited by the family to the funeral of Coretta Scott King. And then in his old age, he liked jumping out of planes. He did it when he was 70, 80, and when he was 90. And then he died in 2018 And he's 94. But if he had lived until this year, in 2024, to age 100, he almost certainly would have been trying to jump out of a plane. So, one of two father-son sets of presidents, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush. An interesting character in American history.